Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening to our September meeting for the Pelagic Sailing Club. We have the pleasure this evening from hearing from Eric Dolin on his novel slash what exactly is it?
It's a
Nonfiction narrative on rebels at sea, privateering. I invited you. I completely invited you. Just having a little brain fart here at the moment. But Eric's spoken to this group before, and we've got the privilege of having him speak again. He is a well-renowned author who speaks nationally. He's going to be taking a couple of trips here in the near future as well to some other sailing groups and some other sailing clubs. So we are greatly privileged to have Eric, who is a local Bostonian, come down and present in person. So without any further ado and gilding of the lid, I'm going to introduce Eric to give his presentation on Rebels at Sea.
Okay, just put that on. And also, is it possible to turn down or turn off some of these front lights or some lights? See if we can do that. But anyway, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm actually not a Bostonian. I live in Marblehead, which is near Boston, although I had lunch in Boston today. So, that's great. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to be back. And thanks for showing up, and thanks for feeding me as well. Appreciate that. Oops, let's see. Anyways, late in the day on June 3rd, 1780, when Salem Captain Jonathan Harridan and his privateer, the Pickering, were heading for the friendly port of Bilbao, Spain. The British privateer Achilles, however, stood in the way. Nobody would have faulted Harridan had he fled in the face of this superior foe. Am I in your way? Do you want to move or the image? No. I mean, I don't want to block people's image, but anyway. While the Pickering had a crew of 38 men and 16 cannons, the Achilles bristled with 132 men and 43 cannons. Hardly a fair fight, but that's not the way that Harridan saw it. He relished the chance to strike a blow for the revolutionary cause by confronting the enemy. Turning to the British prisoner who had informed him of the Achilles' might, Harridan calmly said, "I shan't run from her." And he didn't. As the Achilles began its advance, Harridan told his men that though the Achilles appeared to be superior to them in force, he had no doubt that they should beat her off if they were firm and steady and did not throw away their fire. Meanwhile, in Bilbao, word quickly spread that there was about to be an epic battle just offshore between a British ship and an American ship, and about 1,000 people rushed down to the beach to watch the spectacle. Booming broadsides and musket fire filled the air. One of Harridan's crew said that while shot flew around him, Harridan was as calm and steady as amidst a shower of snowflakes. The battle raged for more than 2 hours. Then Harridan told his men to put bar shot into the cannons. Bar shot is essentially two cannonballs connected by an iron rod. And when that exits a cannon, it spins wildly, shredding rigging and masts, and even smashing a spar or a mast if it hits it dead on. Now, these projectiles were devastating, slashing through the Achilles' rigging and sails. Having had enough, the Achilles turned and fled with the rebel commander close behind. But the Achilles was too fast despite its injuries, and Harridan finally spun about. He reclaimed a British ship, the Golden Eagle, which he had captured earlier, and the Achilles had taken back. All told, one of Pickering's crew had been killed. His head was sheared off by a cannonball. 8 other men were seriously wounded. Now, I want to tell you a story about this plaque. This is the upper third of a much larger plaque. It's about almost 3 feet wide by about 4 feet high. And I read about this plaque while working on the book. And it said that it had been placed in Salem in 1909 by the Sons of the American Revolution to honor Harridan, and in particular his battle against the Achilles. It also said that the plaque was on the side of a house in the intersection in Salem. I don't know how familiar you are with Salem, but if you know where the witch house is, the Black Witch House and the old Jerry's Army Navy store, in that intersection, that's where it was supposed to be. So I live in Marblehead. I hopped on my bike. I went over there to see if I could find the plaque. I had no luck. I found a bunch of other historic plaques that I didn't know were there. So I went back home and I called the Salem historian and I asked her what happened to the plaque. And she started to laugh and she goes, well, it's inside the Korean barbecue restaurant right down the street, which in fact, it ended up to be true because I hopped back on my bike. I went over to this Korean barbecue restaurant. I walked in, it was in the height of COVID. The woman was so excited to see me. She thought I was there to order some food, which I unfortunately I had to tell her, no, I'm here to look at that plaque behind your head. And there it was. And I think that is sort of emblematic of the way that privateering has been treated in American history, sort of shunted aside. Now, Harridan, no, I'll answer questions at the end if you don't mind. Okay. Harridan remained in Bilbao for 2 months before heading back to Salem. On the return cruise, true to form, he captured 3 more British prizes, sent them into Salem. And when he returned to Salem, the owners of the vessel decided to reward their intrepid captain by giving him this silver tankard and 2 mugs or little cups that had the image of the Pickering on the side and his initials. And my wife, Jennifer, she only comes to one of my talks for each of my books. This is my 15th book. But she makes an exception. If I go to Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, she comes. And I went to both places this summer and she came. So did my kids, actually. But the first talk that she came for this book was in Newburyport. And this slide showed up. This image, the object happens to be owned by the Peabody Essex Museum. And my wife and I were married in the Peabody Essex Museum. We were the first wedding ever held there. And there's a long story behind that. But anyway, I mentioned that. My wife's sitting in the audience. And then all of a sudden, Chris said he had a brain fart before. I forgot what year we were married in. I didn't know it was 94 or 95. That did not go over well with my wife. So anyway, now during his tenure in the Massachusetts Navy and as a privateer, Harridan took many prizes, captured hundreds of British cannons, nearly as many prisoners, and he died of tuberculosis at the age of 59 in 1803. The local paper, the Salem Gazette, wrote in his obituary, they lauded him as one of the most able and valiant naval commanders that the war had produced. Now, the Pickering was one of nearly 2,000 American privateers during the Revolution, and Harridan was one of probably 30 to 40,000 men who served on board those privateers. Privateers were armed vessels owned and outfitted by private individuals who were given government permission to attack enemy ships during times of war. That permission came in the form of a letter of marque, which was a formal legal document that gave the holder the right to attack belligerent ships, bring them into local ports, have them adjudicated before a vice admiralty court. If the prize was found to be a legitimate one, then the ship and the cargo would be sold. 50% of the proceeds would go to the owners or investors in the ship, and the other 50% would go to the men who fought on board the privateer. The proceeds from, actually, that's what I was going to say here. The proceeds are split. Missed that. Now, despite the contributions made by Harridan, many tens of thousands of other privateersmen, the story, or many believe that privateering was a sideshow in the war. Privateering has long been given short shrift in general histories of the Revolution, and I think more unfortunately in maritime histories of the conflict. Rebels at Sea fills the void by offering a comprehensive account of privateering that demonstrates that it was critical to winning the war. American privateersmen took the maritime fight to the British and made them bleed in countless daring actions against British merchant ships and not a few British warships. The privateers caused British maritime rates to rise precipitously, diverted critical British resources to protecting British merchant ships and to attacking American privateers, added to British weariness over the war, and played a starring role in bringing France into the war on the side of the Americans, which was critical to the effort. On the domestic front, privateering brought much needed goods and military supplies into the new nation to be, provided cash infusions for the war effort, boosted coastal economies, and gave Americans confidence that they might actually win this war against what was at the time the most powerful nation in the world. Thousands of books have approached the revolution from virtually every angle. Rebels at Sea places privateersmen at the very center of the war effort. It demonstrates that when the United States was only a tenuous idea, they stepped forward and risked their lives to help make it a reality. In fighting against the British on the ocean, the Americans relied on four maritime forces. There were state navies, Washington's secret navy, which only operated for about a year near the beginning of the conflict, the Continental Navy, and privateers. And of these four, privateers were by far the most numerous and the most effective, capturing somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,600 to 1,800 British ships, worth many millions of pounds. Now, Massachusetts, where we all are, is proud of saying they're the first in a lot of things, and they were the first in privateering. They passed the first Privateering Act on November 1st, 1775. And the importance of the Massachusetts Privateering Act in unleashing the privateering impulse throughout the colonies was even clearer in hindsight. Some 40 years after the American Revolution, John Adams would write that the passage of the Massachusetts Act is one of the most important documents in history. The Declaration of Independence is a trifle in comparison with it. New Hampshire and Rhode Island followed suit in early 1776, passing their own privateering statutes. And at the same time, pressure was building on the Continental Congress to get in on the game and pass its own privateering law that allowed privateers to issue from all 13 colonies. And they did so on March 23rd of 1776. Now, with their capital tied up at the docks, merchant owners of ships leapt at the opportunity to send their ships out as privateers, because not only did it gainfully and hopefully gainfully employ their ships, but if the ships were successful, they would come back with cargo and vessels that they could sell. This guy, Elias Haskett Derby, you probably heard of Derby Wharf in Salem, named after him. He was the first millionaire in the United States. Now, many men invested in privateers. Indeed, there was a speculative frenzy that rippled across the colonies, sort of like the frenzy over Bitcoin. Among the more illustrious speculators was Generals George Washington, Nathaniel Greene, and Henry Knox, as well as Paul Revere. Now, privateer captains would usually be hired directly and offered the largest share of any prizes taken. This guy, Elias Davis Sr., he was out of Gloucester. He has the distinction of getting the last letter of marque during the American Revolution in March of 1783. If you ever go to the Cape Ann Museum, there's a beautiful house attached to it. It is the Elias Davis house. If you go into that house during one of their infrequent docent tours, you will see this painting over the mantelpiece and the fireplace. Now, keep in mind, I was writing this book during COVID. So I actually wrote this book a lot faster than I've written any other book. Normally, it takes me about 18 months to about 22 months to research and write a book. This one I finished in about 15 months, because what else did I have to do? But my daughter was home at the time. My daughter's a literary agent in New York City. She came home. My son was a student at Northeastern. He came home. My wife had a job. She came home. And I have to tell you, they were the worst coworkers I've ever had, because I'm somebody, I work very intensely and I like to take a lot of breaks. And I would wander into the kitchen or the TV room and I'd want to chat with one of my family members. And they invariably were way too busy to talk to me. So I was very happy when COVID let up a bit and they all left the house and left me alone. But my daughter was there. And you have to keep in mind, my kids have not read any of my books, except my daughter read my pirate book, Black Flags, Blue Waters. So I called Lily into my office. I said, Lily, take a look at this guy. He's a privateer captain. And she took a good long look at Elias and she said, you know, Dad, I could really get into privateering. Anyway, while crewmen were sometimes known by the owners prior to being hired, most of the time they weren't. And the way that they were recruited was through something called the hearty welcome. The owners would basically invite prospective crewmen to local pubs and give them as much liquor as they wanted, and then they would sign the Articles of Agreement. Now, black men served on many privateers. Some of them were freemen, like James Fortin here. When he was 14, he signed on to the Royal Lewis, which left Philadelphia. Fortin's job was to bring gunpowder from the magazine to the cannons. The cruise was a triumph. The Royal Lewis captured 7 vessels, came back into Philadelphia, sold them, earned a bunch of money. He gave some of the money to his family. And Fortin was actually quite lucky because during one of the battles, a cannonball came through the bulwarks and killed 3 of the men at one of the cannons and left James Fortin unscathed. But he decided to go out again on the Royal Lewis. And in hindsight, he shouldn't have been so eager because barely a day out of port, the Royal Lewis was captured by the HMS Amphion, captained by John Baisley. Now, Fortin got panic stricken because he knew that any men of his complexion that were captured by the British would be sent to a slave mart in the Caribbean. And he thought that was going to be his fate. But fortunately for him, for reasons that we are not clear about, John Baisley, the captain, chose Fortin to be the companion to his son, his 12-year-old son, who was on board. So for 3 to 4 weeks, they got along famously. So when the HMS Amphion pulled into New York City, where Baisley was going to deposit all the men from the Royal Lewis onto the Jersey prison ship, a hellish place to go, he gave Fortin an alternative. He said, you can either be disembarked with the men of the Royal Lewis and go to the Jersey prison ship, or you can go to England as a ward of my son. You'll be well educated, you'll have money, and you'll have your freedom. What do you decide? James Fortin decided to go to the prison ship. He was a true patriot, and he lasted, amazingly enough, for 8 months on that prison ship before being traded in a prisoner exchange. And what's even more fascinating is after the war, James Fortin, a man who believed that his new country would live up to the ringing words of the Declaration of Independence and that all men were created equal, he spent his entire life fighting for that. When he died in 1842, he left a fortune of $70,000. He was the leading sailmaker in Philadelphia. But more importantly, his friend was William Lloyd Garrison, who you may know as an abolitionist. William Lloyd Garrison wanted to start a newspaper called The Liberator. He needed seed money. James Fortin provided the bulk of that seed money. So he's a fascinating character in American history. Now, other black men were enslaved persons who ran away hoping to gain their freedom. Then there were owners who rented out their enslaved persons to make money. Now, this painting has a fascinating story. It was owned by a urologist in Rhode Island. That's not why it's fascinating. But it was thought to be the only known painting of a black American privateersman during the Revolution. And as such, it appeared in a number of books about the American Revolution. And in the early 2000s, Fraunces Tavern, which is a historic site and museum in New York City, wanted to launch an exhibition about black participation in the American Revolution. And it was going to use this painting as the centerpiece of that exhibit. So they contacted the urologist. The urologist said, sure. He got excited. He sent it out to an art conservator. The art conservator took a mild solvent and started rubbing the hand. Off came the black paint, revealing a white hand beneath. It turned out that somebody during the mid 20th century realized correctly that a unique painting of a black privateersman would be worth a lot more than a painting of a white mariner painted over the painting. And he was right. When it was thought to be a black privateersman, it was estimated to have been worth $300,000. When it was seen to be a fake, it plummeted to $3,000. And needless to say, Fraunces Tavern did not use it as the centerpiece of their exhibit. Now, then there were those black men who were treated as transient property. A lot of American privateers captured British slave ships off the western coast of Africa. The black men and women on board and children were not emancipated. Instead, they were sold in the slave marts in the colonies and in the Caribbean. So this, in effect, transformed American privateers into slave traders. Now, many have argued that privateersmen were motivated more by greed than patriotism. Famed naval officer John Paul Jones believed it was nothing but greed. A less cynical assessment views privateersmen as being motivated by a combination of profits and patriotism, and this view is closer to the truth. Part of the reason privateering was scorned was that many believed the practice undermined the Republican ideals of the Revolution, which called for the sacrifice of private interests in the pursuit of liberty. According to Mercy Otis Warren, shown here, author of one of the earliest histories of the Revolution, privateering had a tendency to contract the mind and led it to shrink into selfish views and indulgencies totally inconsistent with genuine republicanism. Many of the founding fathers and mothers and other elites agreed in theory. But in practice, however, many elites had a more complex view of patriotism, one that wasn't based on hewing to Republican ideals above all else. The majority of the delegates to Congress clearly believed that privateering was a patriotic endeavor that served the public good. They made it a major part of America's war effort, fully cognizant of the fact that it made many individuals, including many congressmen, rich. Had Congress deemed that privateering worked against the public good, or that it wasn't a net benefit to the war effort, it could have ended the practice any time, but it never seriously entertained that notion. And that's because they didn't view patriotism and the pursuit of profit as being mutually exclusive. Now, the argument that privateers were only in it for the money implies that others engaged in the fight were not. And that is not true. While the men who rose up after the Battle of Bunker Hill were burning with patriotic fervor, that fire was difficult to maintain for many soldiers throughout the war. The only way that Congress could maintain some semblance of a fighting force was to offer cash bonuses and the promise of land to induce men to serve. And even then, many walked off the job. The Navy was no different. The mariners who joined the various navies were all partially motivated by money. Not only did they get a base salary, but they also got a cut of the prizes that they captured. This recruiting poster, which was put up all around Portsmouth, New Hampshire, was put together by John Paul Jones, could have just as easily been a recruiting poster for a privateer. In it, it promised the men an opportunity to distinguish themselves in the glorious cause of their country and to make their fortunes. Now, the perspective of most privateersmen is best reflected in the comments of a privateersman and a soldier named Christopher Prince, who said, looking back on his revolutionary career, through the whole course of the war, I've had two motives in view. One was the freedom of my country, and the other was the luxuries of life. Privateers experienced many triumphs and tragedies during the war. One of the most successful privateers was the Philadelphia brig Holker, which over the span of 4 years and 11 captains captured 72 prizes. In one particularly valuable cruise, it captured 10 prizes, brought them back to Philadelphia, and they were sold for £2 million. Now, one of the worst tragedies to befall privateers occurred during the Penobscot expedition, the largest American maritime force assembled during the Revolution. And it consisted of 19 warships, 12 of which were privateers. I just want to add that when I read about this, I was amazed, but I was amazed by almost everything in the book, because every single book I've written, with the exception of one, is on topics I didn't know a lot about. My undergraduate, master's, and PhD are in biology and public policy, not history. The only book that I ever published that I knew a lot about was one that Brian Pitt was involved in, was Political Waters, about the cleanup of Boston Harbor, because my dissertation at MIT was all about the cleanup of Boston Harbor. And while writing that, I hated the policy, the hypothesis testing in it, but I loved the history. So that became a book. But the reason I pick topics I don't know a lot about is you may think, because I don't know a lot about a lot of things, which is true. But the other part of it is I have to work on these books so long that I want to remain engaged and I get bored very easily. So if I pick a topic I don't know a lot about, every week I'm learning something new. And one of the things that I learned in writing this book that fascinated me incredibly was the Penobscot expedition. Because as I said, it was the largest maritime force ever collected during the American Revolution. And I would wager none of you or few of you have ever heard of it. Their mission was to dislodge British forces that were building a fort on a peninsula in Penobscot Bay, where modern day Castine is today. That fort was Fort George. And part of the reason the British were building that fort was to establish a base from which they could sally forth to attack privateers and privateer bases. Now, the expedition sailed from Boston on July 19th, 1779. Poor organization and leadership and a critical delay in launching the attack led to a fiasco when on August 14th, the Royal Navy arrived at the mouth of the Penobscot Bay. It was a complete rout. In the end, 16 American ships were burned by their own men to keep them from falling into the enemy's hands, and the rest were captured or sunk. And to make matters worse, after weeks of delay, the Americans had finally decided to launch an attack on Fort George. So all the cannons on all of those ships were primed to be fired. So when the fire reached those cannons, they exploded, sending shrapnel all over the place. As for the men, they bolted into the woods and tried mightily to get back to Massachusetts, the lower part of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And probably a couple of hundred of them died in the attempt. Now, many have labeled this the most devastating naval defeat that the United States suffered up until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Now, one of the most important things that privateers did during the war is to help bring France into the war as our allies. In the early years of the war, France allowed American privateers to use their ports in the Caribbean and in France to reprovision, sell prizes, get other supplies, and also bring on French sailors to supplement their crews. They're building a privateer outside. Now, all of this was in violation of treaties that France had with Britain. And that, plus the damage done by privateers, infuriated the British. The Continental Congress sent William Bingham to the French colony of Martinique, where a large part of his job was to extend American privateering efforts. It worked brilliantly. In 1778, it was estimated that American privateers had captured more than 250 ships in the Caribbean alone, and that trade between Great Britain and its sugar islands had plummeted by 66%. And keep in mind, that was the number one source of external income for the British government. So alarming were these figures that the Earl of Suffolk urged Parliament to keep them from the public, pointing out the impropriety of acknowledging what ought not to be acknowledged at so critical a period, the weakness of the nation. Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin, who appeared to be everywhere during the American Revolution, was in France to negotiate a formal alliance. He was convinced that privateering was helping the American cause with the French, while at the same time injuring Britain. That which makes the greatest impression in our favor here, Franklin wrote, is the prodigious success of our armed ships and privateers. London's public advertiser asserted that if France continued to allow American privateers to sail from French ports, an immediate war between France and this country will be the inevitable consequence. The crucial turning point in getting France to ally with the Americans, of course, was the significant battle success in October of 1777 in Saratoga, when General John Burgoyne's British forces were defeated by the Americans. Now, privateering, while not causing a sharp turn in American fortunes on its own, helped create the situation in which this great American victory could prove decisive in bringing France into the conflict. And it did so by greatly increasing the enmity between France and Great Britain and damaging the British economy. Now, arguably the most horrific chapter in the American Revolution and the most difficult chapter for me to write was the one about the British prisons, both those in Great Britain and those in New York. The majority of the prison population were privateersmen. Now, the two main prisons in Britain were called Mill and Fortin Prison. And between them, they only held about 3,000 people during the entire course of the war. And the death rate there was 3 to 6%, which is on par with other prisons during this era. Now, Mill and Fortin prisons were bad enough, but by far the worst experience any combatant had to endure was to be placed on one of the British prison ships. There were 19 of them in New York City. They were moored off New York City in Wallabout Bay, most of them, which is right near where the Brooklyn Navy Yard is today. There were between 15,000 and 22,000 men on those ships during the war. All of the prison ships were dreadful, but the Jersey was by far the worst. Nicknamed Hell Afloat, the Jersey had been a fourth-rate 64-gun warship. The largest of the prison ships, the Jersey held at any one time between 850 and 1,200 prisoners. Between 6 and 12 men died every day. First thing in the morning, the British guards would call down to the men below in the lower deck, "Rebels, bring up your dead." And not only did the rebels have to bring up the dead, they also had to help bury them on the nearby land. One of the inmates left the following damning portrait of his time on the Jersey. There were about 1,100 prisoners on board. There were no berths or seats to sit down, to lie down on, not a bench to sit on. Many were almost without clothes. The dysentery, fever, frenzy, and despair prevailed among them and filled the place with filth, disgust, and horror. The scantiness of the allowance, the bad quality of the provisions, the brutality of the guards, and the sick pining for comforts they could not obtain, altogether furnished continually one of the greatest scenes of human distress and misery ever beheld. The number of deaths on the Jersey alone is shocking. The best estimates points to it being roughly 11,500 men, most of them American privateersmen. By comparison, in the entire war, somewhere between 4,400 and 6,800 Americans died in the direct line of battle. Now, one of the biggest criticisms of privateers is they drained manpower, munitions, and cannons from the Navy, and that's absolutely true. Many men chose to become privateers because they thought they could earn more money and have less regulation. But that doesn't mean that had there been no privateers, that the Continental Navy would have suddenly been transformed into a fiercer fighting machine. There are only about 60 Continental Navy ships fighting on the Atlantic during the American Revolution. Building and assembling a Navy from scratch would have overwhelmed a smooth running and well-financed government. For the relatively inexperienced, poorly staffed, and financially strapped Continental Congress, it was an almost insurmountable challenge. The Continental Navy's record during the war is not an enviable one. 28 vessels were captured or destroyed, and many others were lost at sea, sold, returned to France, or burned to keep them from being taken by the enemy. At the war's end, there were only a few Navy ships left. There were, however, a few bright spots during the war for the Continental Navy. Raids on Caribbean munitions depots brought back valuable ammunition. Navy ships did an excellent job of ferrying diplomats and correspondents across the Atlantic, and they captured roughly 200 prizes. Nevertheless, in July of 1780, John Adams, who was a huge fan of the Navy and a huge fan of privateering, wrote, "In looking over the long list of vessels belonging to the United States, taken and destroyed, and recollecting the whole history of the rise and progress of our Navy, it is very difficult to avoid tears. The American Revolution was the Navy's first hour, but not its finest." And just to give you some evidentiary support that I'm not ranking on the Navy, I gave this talk at the U.S. Navy War Museum in Washington, D.C. And sitting in front of me, I think he's a former admiral, he's the head of the museum. And when I said that, it was the Navy's first hour, but not its finest, he nodded yes. And he didn't keel haul me, which I thought he was going to do. Anyway, if there had been no privateers, the Navy wouldn't have suddenly been a great fighting force. It wouldn't have been able to go toe to toe with the British. There would have certainly been more men to man Navy ships, and there would have been more cannons and ammunition going towards the Navy. But Congress wouldn't have had suddenly more money to devote to the Navy. In the absence of a powerful Navy, America relied heavily on its privateers. Under the circumstances, that was the best strategy available. We're almost done. On the home front, privateers contributed mightily to the American economy. Privateering was a great economic boon to coastal towns and cities, keeping many businesses afloat during the war and creating new ones and new fortunes. Actually, in Boston, there's a study done about 15, 20 years ago that showed of the 19 leading fortunes of men, merchants basically, in Boston, 17 of those men increased their fortune from the beginning of war to the end of the war, and 17 of them had invested or owned privateers. Each prize auction delivered a new stream of commodities into the colonies. In August of 1775, a thankful Pennsylvanian told Congress that privateers have rendered us the most essential services and brought us many articles for public and private use, without which the war could hardly have been supported. Privateering also had a psychological impact on the war. During the American Revolution, there were 30 newspapers in the colonies. They had hundreds, if not thousands, of articles on privateering. A lot of the articles were positive, were negative, but more were positive. And they gave people confidence that we might actually win the war, especially in the early years of the war when almost all the news coming from the Continental Army and Navy was bad, if not disastrous. Now, the formal end of the war came on September 3rd, 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed. Surviving privateers were transformed into merchant ships, and they played their part in transporting America's wares to distant ports, proudly flying the new nation's flag. The men who owned and financed the privateers, as well as those who had chosen to fight on their decks, looked back on their accomplishments with pride and wondered, as did all Americans, what the future would bring for themselves and their new country. That's the end of my talk. Before I finish, I want to make a comment. That sawing and hammering didn't bother me, but it did bring to mind a story from early on in my career. I wrote a book on the fur trade called Fur Fortune and Empire. And after that book came out, I went on a 6-week book tour from Montana to New Mexico, driving. I had a lot of interesting experiences during that tour, but one of them was speaking in Pinedale, Wyoming. And they had put aside the biggest hall in Pinedale, Wyoming, and the Museum of the Mountain Man is in Pinedale, Wyoming. And I expected a huge crowd. Well, I got there, and the woman who ran the museum, she was a little sheepish. What had happened is one of the big oil guys in town, Pinedale is an oil community, decided to pick that night, and I take this personally, even though he doesn't know me, pick that night to have the biggest soiree of the year. Everybody in town was there. One person showed up for my talk. And I said to the guy, I'm not talking to you. We'll go out for a beer. I can't give a talk to you. But it got worse. The next day, I was at a stoplight. And there's a car, there's a flat, like a F-150 in front of me with a bunch of elk antlers and some other animals in the back. He's right in front of me. It's a red light. I am in my rental car. I'm about 4 feet behind him. I wasn't very close. He starts backing up. I hit the horn. He keeps backing up. He smashed the front of the rental car. He got out and he was laughing. He's a local guy. I'm convinced that he knew I was the Yankee in town to talk. Luckily, the rental company picked it up. Then the final insult is I left town at 6:30 in the morning. This is a small town. I came out of a hotel, which was on the edge of town. All I had to do is take a left and go off into the desert, the high desert. Well, I'm from the East Coast. You probably heard of a rolling stop. There was actually a stop sign at the exit of the hotel. So I was probably going 2 miles an hour. I didn't fully stop. I pulled out. The sheriff gives me $100 ticket. I said to him, I said, it's 6:30 in the morning. There's not a single person on the road. I was going 2 miles an hour. Sorry, buddy. Sorry, that's my story of Pinedale, Wyoming. So I don't think that was maliciously done, but I often wonder. I'm never going back to Pinedale, Wyoming. Anyway, so I'm happy to answer questions if you have any. Yep. Right. Right. Vice Admiralty Court. Yep. Yep. The owners, yeah. No, the owners of the privateer, the American owners, like the merchantmen and the investors. Yeah, yeah. Not the British. Yeah. Right. They lost their ship. Yes. No. Oh, lots. No. Oh, which wars were privateers active in? Oh, a lot of them. King William's War in the late 1600s, the War of the Spanish Succession from 1702 to 1713, the War of Jenkins Ear in the late 1740s, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War in the 50s and 60s, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Civil War, believe it or not. I have a little bit in the book about that in the epilogue, but yeah, so privateers have been very active both when the colonies were colonies and when we became the United States. In 1855, 55 nations after the Crimean War, one of those wars that you learn about in high school, but you have no idea what it was about or why it was fought. And I can't remember either. But after the end of that, there was a big maritime treaty that was signed by 55 nations to outlaw privateering. And the United States said, sorry, we are not going to sign. And that's because we still didn't have a very large Navy. This is before the Great White Navy and Teddy Roosevelt. So we wanted to have privateering in our back pocket in case we needed it again. Well, lo and behold, along comes the Civil War. During the Civil War, who issues privateering letters of marque? The Confederacy. The Confederacy decided to issue empower a bunch of privateers to attack Union shipping. And they didn't do a very good job. They did it for about a year and a half. But what happened that was fascinating is the Union captured a privateer called the Savannah, and they brought it into New York City. And they put all the Confederate men on the Savannah in manacles. They paraded them down Broadway to jeering crowds. They threw them in the Tombs prison. And then Abraham Lincoln threatened to hang them for piracy. Not remembering really, we have a great tradition of privateering, but anyway, he's going to hang them for piracy. So Jefferson Davis said, Abe, he didn't really today, he wrote a formal letter, Mr. Lincoln, you better not start hanging our sailors, because for every one you hang, I will hang a Union man. And Abe Lincoln decided, okay, we're not going to hang any of these guys. They were kept in jail. And after about a year and a half, the Confederacy, privateers were not doing much in the war. The Alabama and the Shenandoah and some of the Confederate raiders were having much more success. And so privateering died out. But what's even more interesting is Abe Lincoln considered resuscitating privateering for the Union, but he never pulled the trigger. And that's mainly because if you know your history of the Civil War, when the sides severed, the Union got almost all the ships. The Confederacy was in bad shape on the ocean. So that's a long answer to your question, but okay. They were both early on in the war. They were all merchant ships or fishing vessels that were, they'd cut new holes in the bulwarks of the lower decks and for cannons, and they'd add cannons, they'd add swivel guns, they'd add muskets and all sorts of stuff. But as the war wore on, some wealthy merchants like Derby purpose-built privateers. One of the most famous was the Grand Turk, which was out of Salem. It was a 300-ton ship, had 32 or 34 cannons, had a good career during the American Revolution. And then after the American Revolution, Derby, wanted to get involved in the China trade, which launched right after the American Revolution. So the Grand Turk was one of the first American ships to go all the way to Canton and engage in the China trade, which fascinated me because I wrote a book called When America First Met China back in 2012, all about the China trade, has a big section on the Grand Turk and Derby, but I knew nothing about its privateering background. And when I was working on this book, I could put the two together, and it was fascinating. And actually, a lot of our ships that opened up not only the China trade, but the trade with formerly off limits countries because of British navigation laws, a lot of those vessels were privateers during the American Revolution. Yep. Yeah. Well, privateers had very large crews to begin with. You might have a 70-foot schooner or snow or something. You could have 120 people on board. So when they capture a prize, they'll take 7 or 8 of their men, appoint a prize master, put them on the captured ship, put the prisoners in manacles, or sometimes let them go on another ship if there's another ship around, and sail them back into port. But it was a diminishing game because the more prizes you captured, the fewer men you had on board. And it created some problems, some lethal problems for some privateers. There's a privateer called the Eagle out of New London, which was a big privateering port. And they were very successful in and around Block Island and a little further north. And they captured a bunch of prize vessels and they kept sending them back into port. Well, finally, there were 17 British prisoners on board the Eagle and only 16 Americans on board the Eagle. A couple of the British guys got loose. There was an uprising. They killed every American on board except for 2 cabin boys, like 12 or 13-year-old boys. And then they sailed the Eagle back to British-controlled Newport. So that happened a couple of times during the war. So you didn't want to get too greedy. You had to apportion your men and put enough on the new ship. And there are instances, and I talk about some of them in the book, of them putting 7 or 8 or 10 people on a prize ship, and then the prisoners on that prize ship rising up and taking back their ship. And then there's even a story in the book about that happening, and then the Americans chasing and taking back the prize. So it's like the Wild West out there. Yeah.
So, what kind of money could a sailor look forward to on a mediocre privateering?
Well, the truth is most privateersmen how much money could a privateersman make? Most of them probably, if you go by the numbers, ended up dying in prison ships. So it was sort of like gambling. You go to a casino and only a few people win big. There were a number of people that won big. The merchants made out best. But like the Holker, when it came back, or the Royal Lewis, each man on board those ships could make 1,000 pounds sterling. When you consider this is a time when an average laborer would be lucky if they made 6 pounds a week. So, and 5,000 pounds was considered a very healthy fortune for a merchant during the day. So if you hit it rich, you did very well. Most privateersmen did not become wealthy. That's just true. They all had the expectation of becoming wealthy. It's just like pirates. I wrote a book about pirates. A lot of people think a lot of pirates are wealthy. Well, they were gamblers too. Most pirates ended up either being hanged or destitute. There were a few that made a bunch of money, and that's what everybody focused on. But there were enough privateers that made money, and there were enough saving voyages that it continued to be a viable hope to go out on a privateer. I mean, when I think back to the American Revolution, I think about privateers, men and army men and navy men. They had a lot of guts to do what they were doing. It's a lot easier to be a writer. But yeah.
That's a dumb question, but how did they determine, how did the captain of one ship determine whether another ship was an enemy ship or?
That's a good question. Yeah, well, it's sort of a dance at sea, because a lot of ships employed ruse de guerre, which is false flags, and that was very common. So basically, if you came upon a ship, you would look through your spyglass, you know what kind of ship it is, you could see its rigging, you might be able to look on board the main deck and see some soldiers, Marines, in their uniforms. or so you can get a sense of what you're coming up against, but you might not know. Then you get closer together and you yell over in your speaking trumpet and you say, "Who are you?" And they'd say, and then you say, "Okay, send over a longboat with some men. We want to see your papers," depending on who's stronger. And oftentimes the shooting would start then. And it was very common for people like a British ship to have French flags on board, a merchant ship. And the Americans were allied with the French during much of the war. So you come up close, and then when you got close enough, the British ship, even merchant ships that were heavily armed, they would suddenly bring down the French flag, raise the Union Jack, and start shooting away. Because there was some honor in the sense that you wouldn't start the fight until you raised your actual flag. They did that. But pirates did the same thing. They had false flags and stuff. So it was tough to figure out who you were fighting against. And they made mistakes. American privateers captured neutral ships. Sometimes American privateers started fighting with another American privateer before they suddenly realized we're on the same side. So it was pretty tough. No, it's in the Constitution, Section 1, Article 8. Congress can still issue letters of marque, but it's not legal now because they haven't issued any letters of marque. There was a bill introduced in Congress 2 years ago to resuscitate letters of marque to fight against Somali pirates, and some people even wanted them to attack Chinese merchant ships. There's a big debate. I talk about this a little bit in the book. It's not what I'm interested in. I think we have a great Navy. I don't think we should have privateers out there fighting our wars, just like I don't think we should have private contractors fighting our wars. But there is an active debate among a small group of people that want to resuscitate privateering. But if you want a letter of marque, you're out of luck. Not, unless you get your congressman to pass a bill. Yeah. No, it was for each voyage. So the same ship might have 3 letters of marque if they went on 3 different trips. And then at the end of the war, there was a point certain. It was it March or February of 1783, where the Continental Congress said, okay, from this day forward, all letters of marque are void. So you had to come back in, and they sent out circulars throughout the Atlantic to tell all these privateers that were out there. And there are actually a couple of privateers who captured ships well after they weren't supposed to. Some of them got in trouble, but one of them, the Grand Turk, captured a huge British merchant ship, the Pompey, after that circular was issued. The British captain knew the war was over, told the captain of the Grand Turk, the war's over, we're friends now, don't take me. The guy on the Grand Turk said, I haven't heard that, I'm taking you back to Salem. He did. The court in Salem, even though he captured the Pompey after letters of marque were void, the Salem judge ruled in favor of the Grand Turk, and they got that big prize. So I guess all's fair in love and war. I don't know. But, yeah. So anyway, thanks again. I've got, if you're interested, I did bring books to sign and sell, and I've written a lot of strange things in books. I tell this all the time. One of the strangest things is a guy had me write, I couldn't have written this book without you. So, oh, thank you. Oh.
Thank you. Eric, that was a wonderful speech, and I now know it is all about privateering. Very educational and informative. So thank you for your time and being here. And for those of you in the audience tonight, I hope you enjoyed it and enjoy the recording. Thank you very much. Have a